The Picnic podcast sessions are a chance for a deep dive conversation with artists from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds into the complexity of life, work and creating in regional Australia. Think culture, think sharing stories, think food exchange, a long chat over a simple picnic lunch. I'm Lusi Austin, a multidisciplinary creative with Fijian Australian heritage, living on Wiradyuri Country in regional New South Wales.
Oumi, welcome to the Picnic podcast session.
Thank you, Lucy. It's so lovely to see your face and hear your voice.
And yours too. I'm so glad we finally got around to doing this because we've been trying for weeks and it just hasn't lined up for a whole heap of reasons, hospital stays and interstate travel, work.
Musicals and yeah, there's a lot. And I think kids and just family life generally. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It just gets busy, right? And so this is lovely, having some time to have a chat together. And we could have just had this on the phone, but then we thought, how nice would it be if everybody else listened in? That sounds so creepy, doesn't it? But look, I'm so glad that you agreed to do this because when I met you, we met through the Diversity Arts Shifting the Balance Leadership Program, Stage 1. And I just, they're just times where you meet people and you just feel like kindred spirits, and I felt that that sisterhood and that connection with you, and meeting you was just such a highlight of that experience for me. And then we got to see each other again at the Diversity Arts, the Women's Symposium called Breaking Ground. That was amazing.
Which is where, and we had like some intense kind of impostery kind of vibes where we're both on a panel and I look at you and all the stuff that you've done and I'm like, you're amazing, you've done all this stuff. And then you'll say all these really nice things about me. So we kind of joined these panels, felt very like, I didn't feel like I was the right person to be on a panel. And I think we both kind of shared that, and we walked over to get a coffee. And in that moment, I just felt like I just went, and kind of could just let all of that go and just feel a bit more comfortable. So it's nice that we kind of have had those moments together.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things I loved too about that day was held in Sydney. There were similar things for a lot of us that were involved in the arts and we're involved in cultural work. And but we have come from regional areas, and not everybody has that same experience of what that means to come from a regional area. And I guess that's a motivation for me having these conversations, is that for other artists, particularly people from, culturally and linguistically diverse or culturally and racially marginalised communities, or where they are culturally and racially marginalised in a community, they're not the regular kind of slice, the regular demographic in that town. It's lovely to not feel alone. And, I think you and I have shared so many little things together that I go, oh yeah, that sounds really familiar, and that sounds really familiar. And that can go both ways. There's some really beautiful things about living in regional areas and creating in regional areas, and there's some really challenging things too. And I think just being able to have a dialogue about that, an honest, authentic dialogue about that's really a passion for me. And so that's what brings us here. So I was
going to say, is this a good time then to kind of talk about where we each are, what our regional kind of, is that what you're going to ask? And I'm just like,
please, yeah, absolutely. No, please do that exact thing. Yeah.
So I'm here in Griffith, New South Wales, which is like 6 hours away from Sydney. And it's just one of these really weird places where it's a city and it does feel like a city. There's a lot going on, but it is really far away from kind of any, I suppose, creative hub in the way that I suppose the wider arts and culture community see it as. So I've spent probably since 2021 doing a lot of travelling and really making an effort to try and go to events. Like I've been involved with Screenworks since like 2020, and they have a conference once a year, which is in Lennox Head, which is regional in itself. But I've tried to go every year, but it is such a big effort. Like you have to have multiple flights. It's so expensive. And that's been difficult, but I think it has kind of highlighted the things that have been really important to me that I've made the extra effort for. So the Diversity Arts Australia program that we did, although there were a couple of sessions where it was in person, I think knowing that they made a specific, I suppose, allowance, or they really tried to get that push to get regional involvement, and you and I were able to then, you from Cowra and me from Griffith, be able to get involved in that, and there be the adjustments that mean that I really feel like I was able to do an experience that I would never have been able to do in the way that, you know, usually you just go to a conference or an event and that's it. But this was so engaged, and it was really, I don't know, it really was step out of your life for a day and really do some, I don't know, intelligent, smart, creative work. But yeah, I come back to Griffith and I'm seeing things in a slightly different light since doing the Shifting the Balance program. And I think I already was, and you probably think the same in terms of being in Cowra, and the reason why you're doing some of the stuff that you were doing is because you see these gaps. But now I see the gaps with a slightly different perspective, which is very interesting.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Like when you say a different perspective, is it that because we talked a lot, right, about advocacy. That was part of the Shifting the Balance leadership program, was about, we did a statement of attainment. And part of that was learning about how to advocate well for, you know, representation. And I mean, I'm really big on that, and I've talked about that in previous podcast episodes and in forums and things as well, about for me growing up in the 90s, in particular 80s and 90s, you know, I didn't see a lot of representation of people of colour on my TV screens, but those people that I did, and same for music, because they were the two areas that I wanted to get into, right? Like I really wanted to be on TV or in the theatre, and I also really wanted to sing, and so I looked for those role models. I looked for someone who looked like me, and so many times I would go to, you know, auditions, and I would be the only person of colour there, and I felt like, is there ever going to be space for me? You know, is there ever going to be a role for me? And now we're seeing a lot of that. You know, there are, I mean, I'm a part of like diversity group call outs now for auditions, and that was just non-existent in Australia years ago. So I guess for me, that's something I've always been passionate about. What about for you? Like, obviously, people hearing your voice for the first time, and if they're not seeing you, because we may not have video available for this, they're hearing you and they're hearing someone with a British accent. And, you know, do you want to speak to, I guess, even describe, how would you describe yourself? How do you identify?
So I was born in Burundi in East Africa, which is a tiny country in in the Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda area. Pretty much most of my family, pretty far back, are Burundian and or Congolese. That is, or Rwanda, I don't know, Ugandan. It's pretty, you know, when you do those things where they can like estimate like where your heritage is from, it's pretty consistent.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was born there in 1990, which feels like a very long time ago, but just recently. And then we moved to London in 1994. So I started school and did all of my kind of education and stuff in London. And that's kind of home for me. But I grew up in a family that was a very culturally Black African. My mum is very African. She is an African mum in all senses of the word. Our family is also Muslim, so there is a kind of cultural element that comes from being kind of Black Muslims, which, you know, it's just its own slight different thing. But we had a really strong family day to day, like who we were as our family culturally, even in London. It was really, really solid, and also just a massive extended family. So I'm one of 5 kids. Grew up with my mum and my stepdad, cousins all over the place. I think I've got more people in my immediate family. So either a mum, dad, a sibling of some kind, so stepmom, stepdad, half sister, stepsister, etc., than Jake has in his extended family. So Jake is my husband. He's white British. And yeah, so growing up in London, look, it is, when people talk about Australia being, multicultural and such, I can't help but laugh, because in my eyes, there is there are some serious issues in what people classify as multicultural. London is multicultural. It is very much, you don't even for a second acknowledge that people are different, because if you did that, you would be coming across someone from a completely different background every 1.2 seconds. Like, it is so mixed. And I worked in media for a long time. So our offices were in Great Portland Street, which is near Oxford Street. So that's like tourist hub, all the shopping, lots of bars and pubs and stuff. So I was just really, I think I took for granted how safe I felt in a kind of diverse community day to day. And then I'd go home and I'd have this like really African family. We're just loud and all up in each other's business, and like, you know, multiple languages being thrown around everywhere. Like, I remember asking my mum ages ago, like, what language she thinks in, because she speaks heaps of languages. And she actually said that she didn't really know. And I thought, so my first language was Swahili, but I have lost a lot of that, but I still understand it really, really well. But I think in English. And she said, oh, I don't know. So somewhere between French, English, Swahili is kind of what, but she doesn't know, which is so wild. But
it's a really interesting thing to talk about, because I think when you think about, like, I've just been in Melbourne last week, and, you know, when I'm in Melbourne and when I'm in Sydney, I feel really at home, because there is a real diversity. You know, we walk past a lot of people that are very, you know, it is very multicultural in the actual cities. Whereas when you come out to the regions, you sort of come over the Blue Mountains in New South Wales in particular. You know, from Sydney, you come over the Blue Mountains, and then there's not this great, you know, mix of nationalities and cultures, even though historically there have been in the past. You know, there was a great mining boom, and like the gold rush. There we had a lot of of course, the Landing Flat uprising in Young, with a huge Chinese population, migrant community that came to be established there and really contribute to the community of Young. And, you know, there's lots of pockets of those things. We had the migrant camp in Cowra itself, which was enormous. And yet there's traces of it, but there's not that kind of, you know, it's not like there's a really rich cultural diversity that happens. I mean, there is still diversity here, but it's not in the same level that you would find in a metropolitan city. And I guess I wanted to ask, after your experience of living in London, or being raised in London, do you think that that's the same thing, even in London, that like in the actual city, it's much more multicultural than if you went out into the regional areas of England?
Yeah, so I actually had an ex-boyfriend who lived in a regional area, and I think what I feel like is maybe different in the UK in general than what I've seen in Australia is the actual integration of diversity in your day-to-day. So even if you're somewhere smaller, you kind of, everyone goes to the same shops, everyone goes to the same GPs. And even when you think about things like private health, so in the UK, we've got the NHS. Most people, regardless of whether or not you earn loads of money, you know, aside from, let's say, the top 1%, you all kind of go to your local GP. You all kind of go, the schools are really good in a general sense of, you've got big private schools, but it doesn't feel like a usual thing that people, just because you have money, you go to a private school. We also don't really have, in regional areas, what I found in Australia is there is a lot of Catholic schools. And it's kind of like the Catholic school is almost treated like a private school, which is very odd in a sense. And so in Griffith, what I see, or what I notice from the, I suppose, communities that go to public school versus Catholic school, is almost that private school, state school split that we see in the UK. So, yeah, I think the integration aspect is what feels so different. So in Griffith, for example, huge South Asian community, Indian, it is absolutely massive. So every June, we have the Shahidi Games, which are this huge event that's been going on for years and years and years. They get like 20,000 people that come through to Griffith to basically play all sorts of like traditional kind of, I suppose, South Asian games. They cook for everybody for free. Like, you can go and get like free food and stuff. They have a whole bunch of celebrations. Everyone goes to the temple afterwards. There's a really beautiful temple in Griffith. And so,
wow.
Yeah, but then the weird thing is that in day to day, so I'm really into theatre, for example. I don't know about you, but if I go to the theatre, there is, and this is the same as Sydney because I noticed it when I went, is the patrons that get engaged with the arts. I will always be the youngest person there, and I will always be the only person of colour in Griffith. And I thought that, so I was in Sydney, MJ the musical I went to go see, in Hadestown in the same weekend, when we did the Breaking Ground thing. And even though both of those shows are heavily influenced by Black culture, have got Black performers, Hadestown is, the music comes from that St. Louis kind of like musical vibe that is rooted in jazz and all sorts of, Black music. You look around the audience and I felt very uncomfortable feeling and knowing that I was the only person of colour and I could look around. And I know that, let's say with people who are Aboriginal, it's not necessarily about skin tone, of course, and, I do understand that. But as someone who is so visibly Black, sitting in an audience, watching something that you feel a connection to because of your race or background, and looking around and realising that nobody else kind of shares that is actually it is really a lonely feeling. And I remember feeling a bit, almost a bit guilty that I had this privilege to experience this like amazing like feat of Black culture. Like the person who wrote the story for MJ the musical, Lynn Nottage, she's a Black woman in America. And so sitting there and not being able to share that with other people who share that kind of life experience was really difficult. But I think that's what we get whether you're regional or in metro. So every time Bell Shakespeare comes to Griffith, we've got a great theatre, you go into the audience, it's always the same kind of thing. And I don't know, I think that's where when I was talking about my perspective changing, I look at that and I go, I'm a bit past the point of organisations or those who have the power to actually transform things, going back to an excuse of, well, these people don't get involved, or, well, I think that kind of defaulting to those excuses means that we get more of the same, and regional areas have just so much opportunity I think they've got more opportunity than metro areas to really do something on a small scale and see the impact that it has. But without being rude, people are lazy. You like the status quo. You want to do the same. Yeah.
So you're saying it really could be, do you think it's a classist thing that people are, or is it more just an exposure thing? I don't know, like, is it from kids not being exposed to the arts from a young age, that going to, I mean, for me, going to the theatre, because my mum was heavily involved as a musician, she was a piano teacher, and she'd trained at the con. And so for us, like, she took us to the theatre. I went to Her Majesty's Theatre when it was operating still, and that was a huge deal. She made a big thing when we went to see Phantom of the Opera, and like, it was really a big night out, and I was exposed to that from a very young age, and I think that helped me develop my love of theatre and my love of culture. Do you think that regardless of whether people live in regional areas or in Metro Sydney or metro areas, that they are that there is a lack of exposure to the benefits of the arts?
Oh, so I think that there's two parts that I see this as. People of colour, culturally, racially marginalised people, I think that arts and culture lives in our bones. It lives in the fibre of our being, in the way that we tell stories to our children, the way that we gather around food, and the way we have celebrations. I still, to this day, when you go on, there's these great memes of, I don't know if you've seen it, when it's you just know that a Black person's won an award for Black persons reading it, and the reaction that, let's say, Whitney Houston has as she reads, and it's like, oh my God, it's such and such. Like, there is just we're just a bit extra in our own special way, whether you're South Asian, whether you're Black, African, whether you are Polynesian, whether you are Aboriginal, there is just something that makes us extra. And I think that is just a deep engagement in arts and culture and creativity and storytelling and connections with each other. So I think that exists 100%. But I think that the theatre and arts spaces and institutions, one, price barriers for anyone in general are difficult. And this is actually something that I was making a comment on about. So I'm directing Mamma Mia at Griffith Regional Theatre. Griffith Regional Theatre, an amazing venue, right? Based in Griffith, there are people who are, let's say, within 200 kilometres of Griffith who cost is a barrier to be able to go ever see a show of Mamma Mia at the Lyric or at Her Majesty. That would be so expensive. So you then think about the people who have the privilege to be able to do that. And as much as we don't like to think about it, well, I don't anyway, it does disadvantage people of colour more, right? So you're just keeping money to, keep your family together and, food, clothes, bills, blah, blah, blah. Arts has to be really important to make that sacrifice, right? And so you've got that side of it, cost barrier. But even if you are in the metro area, $200 for a ticket, sure. If you're one person, sure. I just said I'm one of 5 kids, plus my mum and my stepdad. That is 7 tickets of us being able to enjoy something. The first time my family went to a show together was when I paid for all of us to go see Wicked in like 2019, I think, 2018. And that was after we did a community production of it in Griffith. And I was like, my family would love this. But it was so expensive in London. And so that was difficult. But then I think the biggest thing for me is those institutions are not inviting. And I think people, especially, let's say, white people or the heads of these institutions, are really reluctant to see that the things that they put in place that make it uninviting for people of colour or people who just enjoy arts and culture in a different way, that is something that I think a lot of institutions aren't really ready to address in terms of, I don't know, just even theatre etiquette and such.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a show once, MJ the Musical. They've got a whole bunch of Americans, right? And through Shifting the Balance, I got to do this amazing shadowing experience, right, with Effie, who is Black, African, Australian, and literally the absolute goat of everything, right? I love her. She's amazing. But we're watching
Awesome.
a tech run, and then everyone, the cast who aren't in the tech run are in the audience. Someone's singing, all of a sudden they're like, sing, baby, oh, and they're clapping and they're like getting into it. And you feel safer doing that when you can look around and you go, yep, everybody Black, everyone's going to get it. But theatre etiquette is very much, oh, respectful applause. Yes. Oh, lovely, lovely. Yeah.
I just kind of, I guess I want to just shift gears a slight bit and just ask you this question that I've been wanting to ask you, because I just think you're such an articulate, intelligent human who I just love and so involved in the arts. And you've had kind of a double migrant experience, really, in that you've gone from, Africa to England to Australia and to a regional area in Australia. Like, it's just, it's amazing. And there are some people, when I've sort of spoken about the need for picnic podcast sessions or the need for diversity arts as Shifting the Balance, they love me and they support what I do, but I can sort of see sometimes, I guess, a level of not really understanding why this is important, why it's important to, for people of colour or for people who are culturally and racially marginalised in their communities, for them to have the opportunity to share stories or to talk about these things or to see, to have a seat at the table even. Like, can you, I guess, sort of share from your perspective why you think these things are important?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing that I find challenging regionally is that and I don't know about you, but I get pigeonholed a lot in a sense of, because I'm Black, that somehow that gives me context to, let's say, Aboriginal engagement or South Asian engagement, or, I'm from East Africa, and then there's a big community of people from Zimbabwe who work at the hospital. I do not have much in common. I have more in common with Irish migrants in Griffith than I do with migrants from Zimbabwe, let's say, in Griffith, right?
Yep.
So there's sometimes a bit of extra load that comes on me in that I have to almost represent every person of colour, their value to be included in something if I am at an event or if I'm advocating for something in the community, let's say. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is young people. So then that also makes things really difficult because it's like I am going out into the world to try and support all these underrepresented, but in a regional area, it feels like I'm, let's say, my impression is, it comes across as I'm against everyone that isn't different. But I see it as a big responsibility for me because I have a bit more involvement in things at a different level than, let's say, the young 17-year-old South Asian girl who maybe is interested in something arts related or whatever. Even though we don't have much in common, age, background, etc., she has not been given an opportunity to explore anything. And I think the thing that I find really frustrating over the past year or so is that we talk about inclusion and we talk about seat at the table, whereas I really think that people, and especially older white women, need to really come to terms with the fact that as positive as they are and they're thinking, oh, this is going to be great, I want to do this and I want to do that, it requires them to step away from the table and actually just leave the room entirely, because there is a safety that comes from people being able to explore and share in arts and culture that doesn't exist if you're there hovering or you're there hogging a seat. So as much as you're going, oh, let's make room at the table, you need time to actually decide whether or not that table is fit for purpose for the people accessing it. So if you're saying that, nobody's getting involved in your arts events or arts workshops, rather than the same people sat around the table trying to figure out why young people aren't coming, why diverse people aren't coming, why don't you take a step back, look at what your goal is. The aim is to have more people attend the gallery. Is a workshop the right thing? Do you even know that? Have you gone to the school? Have you been to a meeting where these people gather? They exist somewhere in the world. I do understand that it's hard because if you are really passionate about arts, so I'm was chair of Western River in Arts, I'm vice chair now, and I go to these big regional arts meetings and things. And again, I'm the youngest person there. I'm the only person of colour there. So how is it that across 20 regional locations, that the person who is the chair or the person who is the ED or blah, 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 is a person from a very similar demographic? That is nothing against the people who are doing this amazing work in regional communities, because honestly, I think regional communities would not survive without the work that gets done by women in this age group. And that's a whole separate issue. But it speaks to a very clear issue, I think, that people don't want to address, is that the people who are in charge of community arts, culture, engagement are older white women who are the furthest away from these diverse cohorts that we're trying to engage, which is young people, young boys, people of colour. So my view on it is that I want to be considered about how I do it, so as not to distance people who genuinely do have a care for arts and culture and engage in the community. But I think if you're only ever going to see it from your own lived experience, your own lens, and not see why it's so needed, that you can sit in a room of 20 people who look just like you and still not be able to see why the work of diversity arts or shifting the balance or picnic pod, if you still can't see why it is essential that SBS exists alongside ABC, that NITV exists alongside SBS, if you still cannot see why we need identified positions for jobs, that for me is a conversation that I think is harder for me to approach, and I think I have to do slightly differently. And then, do you know what? We can look at places like America with all its problems. I think in terms of engaging various different groups, I think they just have a better way of doing it in arts and culture in general. I think they're a bit more authentic about doing it, and they've got really good communities that really fight for them and advocate for those groups and work well together. So even the UK maybe sometimes, yeah. I'd love to hear your thoughts about, because we both have worked closely with like council and then arts organisations and then at that regional state level as well. I'd love to know from your perspective what you find.
Yeah, I think I've been really, really fortunate with our regional, our RADO, our Regional Arts Development Organisation, and they are incredibly, I would say they're progressive, they're thoughtful, they're really sincere in wanting to support those stories, you know, from particularly people who don't necessarily have the tools or haven't had the opportunity, haven't had the privilege to get those stories out there. They're very supportive of that. And that may just be, so it was really interesting hearing your perspective, because that hasn't been my experience with our RADO here. And I think I'm very, very fortunate to have that. I do see that same issue, though, that you've been mentioning in other organisations in our regional area that are actually probably dominated more here by, the older white male sort of demographic, in terms of them being the decision makers of boards, and again, I know even just saying this, that might open me up to criticism by people saying, what's wrong with being, an older white male? There's nothing wrong with that. We're not saying there's anything wrong with that. And we're not saying that, I think automatically people think we're trying to say black people are better, or black people, people of color or First Nations people need this or that. We're not saying that we're better or that there should be this, this separation.
Yeah.
What we're saying is that because there has been colonisation, and because this is an ongoing process that we're trying to actually, it's not just an event. Colonisation wasn't an event. It's like an entire process. And
everywhere, in every single thing that we do and interact with, it exists. So it's almost like, come on.
If I were living in Fiji right now, maybe my experience would be totally different. I'm grateful for certain, aspects of the way that our society is, but that's not to say that we haven't got issues because of colonisation that we need to constantly be thinking about and decolonising our minds over, because that's truly the only way that we're really going to continue to progress, I believe, as a society, is understanding the authentic, true story of how this country was taken over, and then also how our actual migrant history and how people came here from all different places in the world, and have called Australia home on this land that was never given to us to live. We acknowledge that, and I should have even said, I haven't even said today, but we're in Wiradyuri Country here.
Yeah, we're both
Where are
in
you?
Wiradjuri. Yeah, coming from the UK, I knew nothing about Aboriginal history before coming here. And aside from having watched the Sapphires, literally in terms of what I had seen, like, was it Kathy Freeman? In terms of any kind of awareness of Aboriginality at all was really, not great. But having moved to Wiradyuri Country, one of the biggest, or the biggest in New South Wales, right? One of the biggest in Australia in terms of land that it covers, but also the people,
population.
It's huge. And I think it was it last year or the year before? It was the centenary of the Deloyne in Bathurst, right? So a lot of stuff kind of came up, and you're learning about, was it the Frontier Wars? I don't remember. Yeah. So I'm learning all this stuff constantly. My background's in marketing as well. So I am very interested in how things are packaged and shared with people. Yes. So, if anyone's ever interested in looking up, colour psychology for why, a sale sign in a shop is like red and yellow and red and white and that kind of combination, or why, accountants are always blue toned and that kind of thing. There is a lot that our brain does automatically that assesses the quality of something. And people in marketing and advertising know this. When we're writing words, when we are describing something, when we are media literacy is very important. But when a journalist is writing an article, the words that people use are really important. So I think about the marketing of Australia internationally before I came here and what Australia said it was versus what it is, based on my experience, is an experience in itself, relearning that. And I do feel a bit embarrassed from my perspective and not knowing that, because knowing, in terms of colonization and what's happened in Burundi and Eastern Africa and Africa at large, and I learned a bit about what happened with kind of the Silk Road and India and Pakistan. But not knowing any of that, I felt a bit embarrassed that I almost was very focused on my people and what I knew, not realizing that the same British accent that I kind of speak with is also responsible for dispossession and colonization and, the harm that has been done to Aboriginal people. So, but that is very much rooted in how Australia markets itself. And of course, no one's advertising, hey, come to, this place where we have like difficult relationships with our, traditional custodians. No one's advertised. I mean, New Zealand kind of does it, but that's because they've kind of got more positive message to share. But it is very interesting how it's marketed as a place that either doesn't have Aboriginal Indigenous people, or that everything's good with the Indigenous people. There's this, things are not said, which, I just think it's also a missed opportunity, because it's also a great marketing opportunity from my perspective in terms of what you can use as an attraction for people to come and engage with Australia as a tourist, as a migrant. Investment in Australia as a place is richer by actually just embracing everything that Australia is. And something that you were saying made me think of how we can be really grateful and we can be really appreciative of everything that we have. And I actually don't even think I think it's a problem rooted in sometimes any kind of suggestion or any kind of critical look at anything feels like an attack. And it feels like I have found that white people in general, very generalized, tend to take that a lot more personally. There's a lot more individuality that comes from it. And I actually think that is a core of how different global South communities are and white cultures are in terms of being an individual versus being a collective. And I think part of why it's so hard for people from Australia, the UK, America, Caucasian backgrounds is that they have been raised and they've been socialized in so many different ways to think about themselves. Their value is as an individual. So it's actually probably quite hard when that's all you've ever known. If I come along and go, oh, hey, why don't we do it this way? That's actually a bit of an attack on you as an individual. Whereas if someone said that to me, because I'm never really making a suggestion for my benefit, I've been raised to think as a collective. I'm one of 5 kids. I'm lucky if my mum says my name when she calls me and doesn't say one of my siblings. And I'm used to that. It's so minor, but it's like if she goes, oh, Oumi, Akbar, Rahim, we're all used to it. If she's looking at us, she's probably talking to us. It doesn't matter which name she said. So
I can so relate, because as a mother of 5 children, and my kids will be like, if they listen to this, they'll be like, yes, Oumi, I relate to that, because I'm lucky to not go through the entire, Can
you imagine though, like if one of your kids turned around and was upset that you called them the wrong name, like genuinely upset? Can you even imagine for a second dealing with that as a mum when all you want to say is, what do you want for dinner? Or something, and they hold on to the fact that you've called them the wrong name. So that's how I look at some of these things where it's like, let's talk about racism. I'm not racist. I didn't say you were racist. We're talking about this other thing. Let's just... Yeah. So I find that while I do understand it, I think a lot of that comes from individuality versus kind of collectivist cultures, and also partly from matriarchal to patriarchal kind of community building. So matriarchal community take care of everyone, and it's built on collaboration, whereas patriarchal, where it's more about power and leadership and I think subjugation and oppression actually in some respects. But I don't know how we change that apart from being the best versions of who we are. But I think I do try and be mindful of these older white men, let's say, who don't know any different and possibly don't even know why they're reacting the way that they're reacting to something that is fairly innocent, I suppose.
They're just such great points that you're making, because, yeah, I think that idea of individual sort of benefit, individual identity, you know, and why something is either going to benefit or not benefit a person, as opposed to like a village, a collective, you know, which is where my experience has been in Fiji in life, with my entire family living there, of Dad's family. Like, if you go to the village, everything's for sharing. There is not like, oh, this person owns that book, or this person, like that child owns that. You know, if I take a packet of cards, one day they'll be out being shared under what we call a valal, which is like a, you know, a sort of temporary shelter where everyone's drinking kava, and it's very the social place on our mats. But then, you know, that night it could be in another house, and I'll say, where's the cards? Like, you've been a mo, and they're like, oh, they're over in that house. And then someone might have taken them to another village and crossed a river with them. Like, you hold things in a different light, in a different way, and you see things in a different light through a different lens. And I think that's also another reason why I want to have these conversations, is because if you've never experienced that, if you don't know that, it's great to sort of hear a different perspective, because you just don't know otherwise. You know, if I hadn't been raised in a biracial cultural home, I wouldn't have known that either. And I guess I was talking about this recently with someone and saying, you know, because what you were talking about with the marketing of Australia and the way that you didn't even know some of the history of Australia, you know, this is how Australians living in Australia are. They don't know their history. And so it goes all the way back to, of course, us saying at the beginning of this podcast, and my whole thing is about truth telling, you know, having these conversations that are sometimes awkward. They sometimes make you feel uncomfortable because you think, oh my gosh, nobody told me about that. And, you know, I think about even recently I was having a conversation with someone, and I mentioned exemption certificates that First Nations, you know, Aboriginal people were offered sometimes and could apply for an exemption certificate. And this person, who's a really, you know, intelligent person, was very open, said, I don't even know what that is. And so we were talking about how Aboriginal people living, you know, on a mission, they could apply. That didn't necessarily mean that they were going to get it, but if they paid and they got this exemption certificate, then they had to move off the mission. They could live in town, but it didn't mean that they were going to be treated as a white person. But they also couldn't then practice culture. They couldn't speak in language. They couldn't have contact often with other family members who were living in the mission. They couldn't go back to the mission. You know, there's like all of that. I mean, that's really, really, they're full on issues that we're talking about that
and people don't know. And even just like,
don't know.
And think about what comes to mind when you have something called an exemption certificate. What are you being exempted from, when actually it's taking something from you, as from your identity? And there's something you said that I wanted to mention, because ever since I've thought about this way, it's changed how I think about so much. But have you heard of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs? That triangle thing, right? And I think that speaks so much, because it's this whole thing where you have your safety and food and shelter and blah, 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 and you build up to building your identity comes with like self-actualization and such, right? First of all, the people that he, the Blackfoot people that he went to observe and extract from for his research, it was completely opposite to what he ended up publishing. But I think the bigger point is what you were saying about the village and the cards, is that in cultures like ours, I think identity and value as a human being is a default, is what you start with. It doesn't matter if you self-actualize or never. Your value as a member of this family, this community, this village, this whatever, is a given. Whereas I think that there are some things that people strive for to let's say, yes, safety, but food and shelter and the kind of materialistic things, but also which arts comes into it, is that creative development and like finding that passion and whatever is actually almost like a little checklist of something that I need to do and I need to find, rather than something that we as a community need to I don't know, have available for everyone to engage with however they'd like. We need to offer an arts club for kids because our community needs an arts club. It's not about that one kid that's going to be bloody Van Gogh. And that, I feel like, is just hard to battle when it is about achieving this identity and this self-actualization. Whereas for me, I feel like, well, I could do nothing and I could still be a valuable human being, I suppose. So our striving for something in arts and culture is different because it's not necessarily about achievement, it's about exploration and sharing and truth telling. And I feel like it doesn't end. There's no end point of when are you self-actualized in arts and culture? When have you done enough creative development? When have you, done enough exercise as a sports person to be the best sports person in the world? I think Serena Williams is probably still exercising and still, playing tennis and doing all sorts of things. It doesn't just end. So I find that interesting, especially in regional areas, because it feels competitive sometimes in arts communities for the opportunity to be the person or be the one. Yeah.
Man, there's so many things. Like from that, we could springboard onto so many other things. Like I want to ask you about a million things. So I think this is going to be one podcast episode of a couple of conversations that we will have, and I'm gonna actually write down some more questions, and maybe if anyone's listening in and they want to ask a question as well.
Oh my God, Q&A, that'll be brilliant.
Yeah, they can drop us a little comment into our Substack. That would be great, because I want to ask you at some point about what it's like to now raise a family. For you, when you've been raised in a family that identifies very strongly with culture and your faith, then how does that work for you and the way you're raised? But that's another day. But yeah, the fact that we're talking about, we've talked about visibility and invisibility and the collective and the individual, all of these things. There's just so many great things to talk about. But
we definitely need to do an interracial couples, interracial family thing, which is very interesting. When you look at the full context of it, and there are probably one thing I'd love to share with you and people listening, or just with you generally, is I feel like we should make a list of things that people say that are racist, that they don't know are racist, and that maybe we should just be like, here is to the world, you might not think this is racist, but please don't say this to a person of colour.
That is such a great idea. Do you know what? There was one that I just shared into the autoimmune disease support group that I started up. And it was that, like, please don't say these things to a chronically ill or a person who lives with chronic pain. Please don't say these things. I'll link to it in the show notes if I can find it. But it was, this was just about chronic illness. But yeah.
I'd love to ask you a couple of things as well. So yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah, definitely. I would love that too. And I've been asking everyone before we finish, I want to ask you two things. One thing I want to ask is, could you just very quickly describe your favourite traditional kind of cultural dish? And if I can find a recipe, I'll link to it in the show notes, because that's something that I've been really wanting to share, is like have a bit of an exchange of recipes as well. So I'm going to share that. I'll share something in the show notes. But one of the things I was thinking about recently was I'd already had a curry that I'd shared with Leanne Wong, who was my guest from Bathurst. But my daughter made that recently, and I'm in Melbourne last weekend for our family. And I was thinking about that normally you would have that in Fiji with cassava, and our local, like in Orange, which is an hour and a half away, that we were able to buy cassava, which is like a root crop. We were able to buy that in kind of bulk. And my husband went there this week and they've closed down. And so I'm so disappointed that I can't find Fijian cassava somewhere locally. So because I've got to say, boiled cassava that you have with curry, and the next morning we would wake up and Mum would fry it off, and just a bit of oil and some salt, and that was breakfast the next morning. Fried cassava, just chunks of fried cassava, just chef's kiss. So good.
My go-to meal is rice and kidney beans, and I will hands down say this is the best meal in the world. So Burundian food is mainly vegetarian diet. So my top favourite thing, rice, kidney beans, such minimal ingredients. It is a favourite of everyone involved. Eli, my son, who's 4, loves it. Easy for me to make, takes 10-15 minutes max. Get a rice cooker. I will film myself making it, post the recipe, and I will give it to people because it is so cheap. A can of kidney beans is like 60 cents, right? And then you mentioned cassava, because we eat cassava in East Africa as well, but cassava leaves, which we call sombe, is basically like throw in all the green vegetables you can think of, a bit of oil and some fish, like tinned fish like sardines or kippers or something. When I tell you, it looks terrible, but it is the nicest thing in the world. When my mum came to visit, we made so much of it. We had I'd say like a good 20 kilos of it, like cooked up.
Do you know, I don't actually know. I'm going to have to ask someone if Fijians eat cassava leaves, because I don't actually know that I've eaten them ever.
Well, I'll make it for you. Yeah.
Girl, yes, please. I'm going to look into that. So what do you call that? What do you call that dish?
So the cassava leaves is sombe, which is basically, it looks like a veggie curry kind of thing, but it is just cassava leaves, and then you'll have like green capsicum, you'll have aubergine, which is eggplant, you'll have leek, anything green. There's so many green things, I don't even know. Courgette,
so good.
Zucchini, yeah. But rice and beans is my go-to, and it is a firm favourite all round, and it is rice, beans, salt, all-purpose seasoning, and water. That is the ingredients.
That's so good.
Yeah.
I cannot wait to have a try of that one. Thank you so much for joining me on the Picnic Podcast Sessions. And Oumi, I really appreciate having a conversation with you, because you are just such a beautiful hearted person, but you are someone who's come into my life unexpectedly and have just enriched it greatly with your intelligence and your creativity and your willingness to have open conversation. And I really appreciate you. So thank you so very much, Oumi.
Thank you so much, Lucy.
And I will link to all those things in the show notes that we mentioned, and we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, we will.
Thanks, Oumi.